So welcome everybody to this second Spotlight webinar about the 8 rules of innovation. My name is Karin Kollenz-Quetard. I'm a professor of strategy here at EDHEC Business School, and I'm extremely delighted to be joined today, once again, by Pontus Siren, who is our innovator in residence at the Global MBA program. I've seen already on the register list that we've got quite a few alumni from our Global MBA program. We've got students who will be joining us in the future. So very delighted to be able to share some insights about innovation from Pontus with you today. How is this all going to work? We're going to do a short recap about the first 4 rules of innovation, which have been discussed 2 weeks ago in webinar number 1. And then we'll deep dive into rules 5 to 8. There will be a possibility for you to ask questions. Please just type them in the question Q&A section of the webinar, and we'll be taking them after each of the rules. And then there'll be an extended period for Q&A at the end of the session today. With that said, I'll hand over right away to Pontus to introduce himself, and then start with a quick recap of rules 1 to 4, please, Pontus.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar. My name is Pontus Siren. I'm a partner with Innosight, which is a strategy consulting firm founded by Clay Christensen of Harvard, the father of disruptive innovation. I've been with the company for 10 years now, mainly in Asia, but I recently moved back to Europe. Before that, I have experience in the biotech space, where I spent 10 years with the Karolinska Institute, and before that I was with BCG. But these rules are really a reflection of what I've learned in the past 10 years.
All right, well, thank you so much. Actually, quite interesting. We found out, Pontus and I, that we've been at BCG together in different countries, so we've never met, but the world is small, because the great news is that most of the professors that, particularly those that are teaching at the Global MBA, have some industry experience. For myself, consulting in the telecoms industry. So even more excited to be discussing with a former colleague. Pontus, can you just quickly recap the first 4 rules of innovation that you've been discussing with Sandra 2 weeks ago?
Sure. So we had a really good and rich discussion on the first 4 rules, which were: innovation is predictable. That's somewhat counterintuitive, but we talked about how technology drives innovation and change and all the rest of it, and technology in itself is somewhat predictable in terms of the trajectory, perhaps not the exact timing. We talked about how some of the challenges with innovation is that it's difficult to innovate too early, but it's impossible to innovate too late once others have scaled or captured the high ground in the market. So that's another challenge that leaders and managers have to deal with, innovating at the right time. And of course, innovation is both easy and difficult. I mean, in some ways, we have to give companies credit. They do a great job with what one might call incremental innovation or innovation within the business model. And our TVs are smaller and lighter and certainly a lot cheaper than they were before. But then the same companies struggle a lot when the business model needs to change. So it's an interesting paradox. And the final rule we talked about was not innovating too far from your core if you don't have to. In other words, innovation should be practical. Obviously, the purpose is to drive profit and growth. And if you can do that closer to your core model, then even better.
Okay, thank you so much, Pontus. So that was what was discussed in detail in the first webinar. If you want to hear about that detail, there's a possibility to see a replay. Just contact us, and we'll make sure to make that available to you, particularly if you're part of the Global MBA alumni or the community around the Global MBA here at EDHEC Business School. Well, now then, let's jump into the rules 5 to 8. Rule 5 is about, well, it says never challenge giants with the same business model. Well, that sounds quite evident, but it seems from your experience, Pontus, that even big players often make that mistake.
Yeah, this is probably my favorite rule of the 8 rules, because it's one of those, you know, what in this classic movie were called classic blunders. And challenging an incumbent with the same business model is exactly that. It's a classic blunder, and the results are very predictable. And you kind of wonder how companies do this, but there are lots of examples of it happening. And A.G. Lafley, who I cite in the LinkedIn post, he tells a great story about how P&G, which is a very sophisticated company, wanted to go into the bleach business once upon a time. And they developed a great product, and they had marketing, and they tried to be quite sneaky in that they launched it in Portland, Maine, which is probably the furthest place you can get to from California, where Clorox had their headquarters. And of course, Clorox ended up, having a huge marketing campaign and giving people vouchers, so they wouldn't need to buy bleach for the next 6 to 12 months. And so we have to recognize that these giants, these incumbents, they protect their turf very jealously. And if you challenge them directly with a business model that's similar to theirs, the reaction is very predictable. And I think sometimes what happens is that companies that have a good niche within a certain industry or a certain sector, and they want to grow, it's very easy to step on the toes of the giants. And you'll always provoke a very aggressive reaction. And so the challenge is really to understand what is the motivation of the giants. How will they react if they perceive a competitor entering their market or entering their space? And actually, if you look at the disruptors, they have almost all been ignored. So there's nothing better than to be ignored by the giants in the beginning. You fly under the radar. This is the whole attack from below and so on. Because if the giants are motivated to fight back, they've got much more money and resource to do that. So I think innovators and managers who are thinking about expanding their business, they need to constantly ask this question: are we challenging a much bigger incumbent with a business model that's too similar? And I think we can talk about what the signs are. You can't grow your business beyond a certain point. Your resources and assets and capabilities are actually quite similar. Your pricing is similar. That's very dangerous. Then you struggle to convince the customers that you're different, and you can't really articulate what gives you the right to scale up your business or your expansion strategy. And just a reflection on why leaders do this sometimes. I mean, of course, the legacy business model works. It's successful. We have a lot of data on it. It's kind of predictable. It can be copied. Sometimes the leaders have even worked in that business model, so they've come to a new company and they want to expand and grow the business, and they do it with the same tools that they've learned in their previous career. And I do think probably the biggest temptation is that it's a known entity. You don't have to struggle with the uncertainty, and you don't have to struggle with the profit formulas and so on. Those are known factors, and you can just try to do it. But I do think that companies that do this, they get very quick feedback from the market, and it is listed in those 5 kind of telltale signs that you're probably challenging a giant, with a model that's too similar. So those are some reflections, and again, I think if your cost structure is too similar, that's not great. If your resource capabilities are too similar, that's not great. You want to be different, and you want to be under the radar, and that's something that managers should keep a close eye on. So let me pause there and get your reflections and questions, Karin, and then from others as well as needed.
Yeah, so while we give you a little bit of time, dear audience, to type in any questions that you might have about this first rule, about not or never challenging the giants and copying their business model, I'll start with the first one, because I'm thinking, as a professor of strategy, of course, I'm thinking about differentiation strategy, niche strategy. I don't know, I live in a small village. I'm really happy that I've got an organic food retailer and a wine shop, which are actually quite successfully surviving in their niche here, probably local niche, despite having exactly the same business model as as their giant competitors, which are a little bit further away. So how do you explain that? Is there room for like a niche strategy, which is a local copy of a giant business model?
Yeah, I think that's the way to challenge them, and I think, you know, there's always niches, geographies, specialties that the giants they're not interested in, or they think they're too small, or they think they're too costly to serve, or they just overlook them. And I think retail, you know, has a lot of examples of that. I think the real test is when you try to scale the model, because in some ways the giants, they can afford to ignore the specialty players, and often the specialty players have better customer service, they've got a better customer experience, they've got other attributes that the giants would struggle to replicate. But the real test comes if companies want to expand and they want to go into markets that matter more to the giants. Then that will be the test ultimately. You know, is the model similar, and because the giants will care about their core markets.
Yeah, so probably it's also about if your ambition is not to attack the giant or take away any of their market share, then probably a niche strategy seems to be doable. Yep. But yeah, same business model, same market. So if we talk in terms of strategic innovation, same who, same what, same how, probably that's not a great recipe for succeeding innovation. So for now, I don't see any questions coming in from the audience regarding Rule 5. I guess it was just simply so clear.
There's one more thing I would want to say, that if you want to do this, I think there's a great example with how Microsoft and Google got into the cloud business recently in the last 5 years. That was, you know, AWS had an established model, had large, you know, significant market share and so on. I mean, the exception to this rule is that if you have 10 to 20 billion of capital in your back pocket, you can enter a market with another giant, but you probably have to be a giant yourself. And essentially, both Google and Microsoft bought themselves the right to compete in that market, but the investments were measured in the tens of billions of dollars.
Yeah, and probably it's also a question about the growth, the speed of growth of that market. If it's still relatively early on and there is space for everybody, it might be easier to get in with a similar business model, but certainly to also think about comparing your resources and capabilities, probably. All right, well then we're moving to a part that's particularly interesting to me, which kind of gets from the more technical side of innovation to the leadership and cultural side of innovation, with rule number 6, which says don't innovate without conviction. Pontus, can you expand on that, please?
Sure. So I've worked with a range of companies, a range of industries, a range of leadership teams in different parts of the world, and I would say one of the missing ingredients with making innovation impactful is the lack of conviction in the leadership team, or even the board, or the owners, I guess, represented by the boards. And what conviction really means is that if a company is in a situation where it needs to transform, and obviously not all companies are, but many are, then the leadership team and the board has to be convinced that change is absolutely necessary, and they have to believe that change is also possible. And conviction, by conviction I mean it's a belief. It's not data. Otherwise you wouldn't need conviction. You would just look at the data. But it is a belief, a firmly held belief that you must and you can do something about the changing competitive landscape, disruption, whatever it might be. And it's very dangerous in a corporate setting to develop conviction if you intend to act on it, because that means that, looking back at the other rules, you have to be early. So not all the data is going to be in. The market is changing, it's evolving. You have to believe that you are taking the company in the right direction. You have to believe that the resource investments and others that you're making at this point are worthwhile. You have to believe that there will be, a kind of a payback for everything you're doing now. And at the same time, you'll have lots of people who argue against you, who tell you the market isn't really changing, who tell you the core model is solid, et cetera, and who want to use the resources for something else. Now, if you don't have that conviction, it's very difficult to go through that process of transformation, because there'll be many moments of doubt. There'll be many people who doubt you internally, externally, analysts, the stock market, and then to maintain that conviction, it's tricky. I once had an executive. I did a couple of sessions with them in a business that was slowly being disrupted, and after a day and a half of problem solving and talking about disruption and this and that, he said, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but I have to go to New York City every quarter to explain our results, and the analysts just won't get this. And I'm probably going to retire in a couple of years. So I think we have to recognize that companies are led by people with careers, with aspirations, with motivations, and so on, and they are not 100% always aligned with the kind of the longer term growth trajectory or transformation trajectory that the company might need to pursue. So I think this is really, really difficult. I have seen executives who have conviction. Sometimes it's because they themselves were significant owners of the company. Sometimes because the company had a culture of stewardship. It really had a strong culture of, we are building our business, our careers are built on things that were done, by others before us. And there is a story of that managing that risk and the perception of what happens if it doesn't play out is a real issue for many executives. So I think, and also just becoming convinced is a challenge. Like just convincing yourself, in the beginning is difficult. And these executives and leadership teams are super busy, so they'll find 15 other things to do rather than think about how the industry is going to change in 5 years. And I think what happens is that if you don't have conviction to really transform a company, you might put on a little bit of an innovation theater. And I've seen this more than once, because it's difficult also not to innovate as a leadership team, because people will see internally and externally that the industry is changing. So you have to be seen at least to do something. So sometimes leaders, instead of innovating with conviction, they do what I call innovation theater. They go through some motions, but they don't invest significantly. They don't put resources behind it. And usually in those companies, these types of efforts are on the leadership calendar on Friday afternoon at 4:30. If you see that you're having your strategic innovation meeting on Friday at 4:30, you can be pretty sure that there's a lack of conviction behind that effort. So let me pause there and get your reflections, Karin.
It's interesting what you're saying. I fully agree with you. If there's no conviction on top management board level, it's extremely hard to innovate. Now I'm putting myself into the shoes of our audience. I see quite a few people that I know from former courses at EDHEC, and so probably most of them are not yet CEOs, not yet part of the top management of large international corporates. Now, what can they do to create conviction if they see a disruption coming? They're completely convinced that this is going to disrupt their company's business model. What can they do to kind of create that conviction, convince their managers, top management, and board? What are your recommendations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually, this is interesting because I've seen a lot of middle managers, who often initiate the conversations with us because they see the changing dynamics, and often they are in strategic functions or strategic and innovation functions. So they kind of see how the market is changing, and since innovation is somewhat predictable, they see where the industry is going. I think the answer is sometimes that you can't convince your management. I've seen that certainly happen many times. And I think one has to be somewhat practical about that, because you don't want to, you don't want to, you know, bang your head against the wall if there's no opportunity to convince the leadership. So I think the first job is to kind of figure out, you know, I think very rigorously analyze how big is the threat and how imminent, because, you know, people want to hear your argument. So you have to kind of have a case that you make, and then you have to understand, you know, what type of leadership does your company have? And there are a lot of leaders who are very short term, who might change companies or positions every 3 or 4 years, whatever. And that might not be the most receptive audience. And that's just the reality. However, if you have a receptive audience, which I think is often the case, not always, but it's certainly not uncommon, I think then the question is even more interesting, because you're then thinking about, how do I communicate this? Like, what do I show, and how do I make the case? And I think, you know, of course, there you have to build your case and argument and show through analogies or changing customer habits, what's happening. But I think what the leaders want the most is they want to know, like, what can we do? Okay, so the industry is going to be disrupted in 5 years. Fine, we've got our plans and this and that, but what do I start doing? Like on Monday, what should we do differently? Do we launch a project? Do we scan startups? Do we want to, you know, what do we actually do? And I think the most important thing for a leadership team is alignment. You know, there's 3 things we need to do always in the projects. It's analysis, alignment, and action. And by far, the most important exercise is the alignment piece, because analytically, yes, consultants can do it, smart people internally can do it, lots of different types of roles can do that. But aligning the leadership team is really tough. So I would say to those managers who have a receptive, call it leadership team, it's thinking about, how do you communicate and how do you drive alignment? Because once you have alignment, the game changes completely. That alignment is actually the process of becoming convinced. And I've spent sometimes a year where most of the time we spent with the client was actually spent on alignment.
No, I really like the 3 A's of analysis, alignment, and action. And they actually link in very nicely with a question from Manuel Bordone, who was very close to what I've been asking you, but who says, well, can we change the conviction on the board or top level by influencing them through external experts, trend analysts? So probably that brings in more the analysis side, right, and can help a little bit with alignment, as you've just said.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you can't convince people purely on data, because not all the data exists yet. It's you know, it's directional, and timing is very difficult, and so on. But I do think, you know, bringing in external perspectives is sometimes helpful. Bringing in people who have seen it happen in other industries, and probably the most powerful tool, if you can get your hands on it, is an executive who has gone through the transformation in a different industry. Because having an executive or a senior person, retired or active, it doesn't really matter, talk about how do you recognize disruptive threats, or, you know, the need to transform, and what the journey was like, is super powerful. You know, of course, consultants sometimes do this as well, but if I were to choose like a single tool, I would take a well-known, maybe retired executive who's gone through a transformation successfully, because he will tell you what the signs are, and he will show you that it can be done, because he's done it. He or she has gone through the journey. Again, that's easier said than done, but that's certainly one way to do it.
Okay, that's an interesting one, and it's proven in literature that in terms of what kind of level of people have the biggest chance of influencing you or opening a mindset, it's kind of the same level, and that starts with kids in kindergarten who learn more from the peers than from the parents, and it goes all the way up to CEOs. Let them meet other CEOs who've got experience to share, and let them ask questions. So thank you very much, Manuela, for that very interesting question. Another one, and that's from my side, because I've seen that happening in a telecommunication company I've worked for, is a team of middle managers who just said at some point, can we get the resources to try this out? Because they were so convinced, but the top management said, well, no, it's just too early, it's too much risk, etc. But they were actually okay with providing some resources, some time, 2 days off for the people who were involved. And at the end, that kind of garage experiment proved relatively successful, and it had helped the company to build up a little bit of, well, some capabilities that that then allowed them to be relatively quick in that innovation. Do you think that's something that can be used generally, or is that something that you see broadly?
It certainly can, and I think, you know, it helps you to generate data, which one might call is internal data about how the industry is changing. You know, you might look at how the technology works, and you get to understand the emerging ecosystem better, and the different competitors and stakeholders and so on. So certainly, I think it is a useful tool, partly because it can help drive the conviction. What I would say though, nowadays with so much VC money and so much investment going into the startups, you're too slow often if you don't have proper resourcing. So sometimes you have the luxury of time, but we see that industries are changing increasingly rapidly. So the time, you know, to make meaningful investments from just learning about something is getting shorter. And I find it entertaining that some large companies think that they can, you know, enter let's say a new segment or new growth market in, let's say, banking or financial services by investing, you know, some millions here and there, when the VCs are investing hundreds of millions. Like you're competing against a wall of money who are faster and more motivated than most large companies are. And you know, you're talking about like pocket change in terms of the overall quantum. So I do think the world has changed in that sense, that companies that determine that they need to transform need to make that determination very carefully, and then they need to relatively quickly make meaningful investments.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting insight about the competition that's much more on the VCs, from the money from on the VC side than coming from other large corporates. We've got an interesting comment here from Axel Manke. Thank you very much. Which relates a little bit to one of the previous rules. He says innovation theater might save you from innovating too early. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess it's a trick. It's a good question, and it's difficult to answer because it's very difficult to time, like when you should start committing serious resources and so on. I think innovation, you know, theater or otherwise, is useful if you're learning, if you're really learning about what works, what doesn't, this and that. But if you're just doing it, you know, with fractional resources and no leadership attention, and it's kind of a side project, it doesn't really, I haven't seen it work too well. And I mean, if you think about this example of Nespresso, you know, which is a sizable multi-billion-dollar business today, Nestle bought the patents for that in the early 70s, and they didn't become profitable until the 2000s. And now everyone says what a fantastic business, and every time I drive here in the Vaud region, I see their ginormous factory. But that's 40, 50 years down the line. So I would argue that it's easier to innovate early. You know, you pay the price in political capital and so on. It's not easy. But if you're too late, then you go back to the second classic blunder. Then you've got people or companies that have already scaled up. And you see this in banking. You know, you've got all these payment companies that 10 years ago you could have bought for 10 million bucks. Now they're like in the billions. Impossible for most banks to actually just acquire them. So a tricky question. I do think, you know, the whole question of timing and resource allocation are critical questions that management teams need to wrestle with.
Yeah, and then this is also what we see in research: is start early, but set up your experiments to maximize learning. So try to invest resources in areas where you believe they can actually, in case that innovation doesn't fly, they can be useful for the rest of the company. So very much a resource and capability driven view of the firm, where you say, well, whatever I invest in this innovation is not just good for that if it works, but it helps the company to move in the right direction. Thinking about I don't know, pharmaceutical companies developing new knowledge in genetics, etc. I was like, well, the first medication or vaccine didn't work, but we have developed some capabilities in an area that was pretty new to us before. Okay, the time is fleeting because the discussion and the questions from the audience are so interesting. But let's move on to the next rule, and we'll make sure to take some of the questions that are still up there after at the end when we have a longer Q&A session. So rule number 7, reward innovation. Pontus, to you.
This is my pet peeve because I think in some ways it's a strange world. I mean, we all recognize that Silicon Valley and other startup centers have been very successful, and it's not a secret that one of the key elements is that these people who develop these companies and so on are very handsomely rewarded. And some of them become extremely rich, and some of them just become wealthier, whatever it is. And you know, Silicon Valley would never work if you just said, we'll just give you a monthly salary and go build us $1 billion business. I mean, it would never work. So then you've got multi-billion-dollar companies that are generating lots of free cash flow and so on, who want to build a new growth business, which has to be measured in the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, like for it to move the needle for a very large company. And then you say, we want to do it internally. We don't immediately want to buy someone because maybe it's too expensive or whatever it is. I think the internal team should be handsomely rewarded. Honestly, if I had one thing, because we have like the cookbooks on how to do innovation, we have the cookbooks on test and learn, and we have a lot of good literature on this, that, and the other. But we don't motivate people, and somehow we think that people who are in corporate settings don't care about money. Now, I don't think that's true. I've seen it. I saw one example of this where there was a company. They did their homework very carefully, and we actually helped them with that, but that's neither here nor there. They did the homework carefully on a good business opportunity in an emerging market. There was no competition, digital business model, this and that. And then we ran the whole test and learn, good results, hired people, But when I talked to the manager of this business, who was a very successful, by the way, operator on the core side before they transferred it there, this was his pet peeve. He was doing so much heavy lifting. He could have been recruited to any startup and he would have done great work. And he was getting like a monthly salary and a pat on the back. I don't know like why it's so difficult to say, let's figure out what we need to do. Use consultants, experts, whatever you like. Make sure you get that analysis right. Align the leadership team. Okay. Then handpick some internal people, the best ones you can find, and maybe hire a couple of external ones, and say, here are the milestones. You hit these milestones, $1 million, $1 million, $1 million. What is that to a multi-billion-dollar company? It's nothing. It's pocket change again. But I think the challenge is that suddenly then a person, a relatively junior person, who might wear sneakers and a hoodie to work, is making more money than a regional director. Oh my goodness. But if they build a business that generates a lot of revenue in the tens or hundreds of millions, why shouldn't they get a couple of million? Now, I'm not saying they need to become Silicon Valley billionaires because they still have job security and all the rest of it. But like, can you imagine how motivated they would be if they said, like, you do this? And by the way, it would, because the thing is, you can't force innovation. You can't, because the management doesn't know what questions to ask. They don't know what experiments to run and so on. But if you tell the people, you figure it out, we'll support you and finance you and do this and that. And if you're successful, you can buy a really nice house, debt-free or whatever it is, within reason. I'm not saying you have to go crazy, but just like the pat on the back, I just don't, this is, if I were to change one thing, I would change motivation.
Oh, interesting. Look, I mean, now I'm challenging you a little bit on that because I'm a strong believer in Hertzberg, who says money is just a hygiene factor. It can dissatisfy people, but it doesn't really drive satisfaction. It's not a motivational factor. And I've worked in many companies. I'm now a professor, so I'm not doing that for the money, but just for the satisfaction of being here with you, having all those interesting discussions and working with brilliant students, particularly in the global MBA program. But it's not money that's motivating. Are there any other things that you believe companies can put into place to motivate those innovators that are kind of at the head of an innovation project. If they believe money alone is not it, because if those people were going for money, they wouldn't be in a corporate. They probably would have their own startup, right?
That's right, but I think that's kind of the proof is in the pudding. That I think, you know, doing a startup, I did a startup, an unsuccessful one, I might say, in the biotech space. So I lived this for 9 years, and I interacted with a lot of, you know, other people. There's 0% doubt in my mind, because I lived it, that it is a motivation when you're doing something new and very difficult. Now I agree with you, like as a consultant or in a corporate job or whatever, I think you should pay people the fair salary, and you should motivate them with all kinds of other things, good working environment, career opportunities, blah, blah, blah. No doubt about that. But when you go into to the very difficult game of building a new business with a lot of disappointment, with your career potentially at risk, you know, with sleepless nights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really tough. It's emotionally very difficult. It's sometimes physically exhausting, so on. You know, I just don't see why you shouldn't get some of the upside. Now, I'm not saying it's the only thing that motivates people, obviously not, but I think it's not like any person in any large company can build, like, let's say, a Twitter or whatever company you want to pick, or Klarna, which is a more traditional model. I mean, this is exceptional talent, I would argue. Now, I think large companies actually have some of that exceptional talent, but because of the risk to their career, which I you know, also cite that big companies are not very good at, you know, and the way they perceive the risk-reward ratio is, you know, it's very imbalanced. I tell the story in the post of a company we worked with, you know, multi-billion, set up an innovation function, CEO, big champion. They took this lady from the core business, where she was quite successful and in a relatively senior role, made her the innovation manager, but because her team shrunk, you know, because the innovation team was not 30 people, it was 5. The first day she walked into the office, they took away her car keys. Forget giving her $1 million. They took away her company car. So I'm not saying that, you know, money is going to solve all your problems, but I think if you want to innovate a business model that generates 100 million of new revenue, and you want to do that, you know, largely within the company, I think you should compensate the talent that's able to do that, commensurate to the market, somewhat, at least adjusted for risk and this and that. But what I've seen is that you are asking people to put their career at risk, because often, you know, how HR looks at, you know, KPIs and promotions and so on is very skewed towards the traditional model. You're asking people to put their career at risk with a regular salary and for a very uncertain future. Then you might as well leave the big company and instead go to a startup. But if big companies want to keep those people and harness that energy, they need to address this question. But I would say largely for political reasons and, you know, people's perceptions of who should be rewarded however much, it very rarely happens. And I find it baffling, because it's not even that expensive.
Yeah, it's a pity. Well, I mean, what I see around me is sometimes that companies actually say, well, if you succeed, that's kind of a ticket for a big promotion and more responsibility that can be rewarding. But probably you're right that corporates are not aware that they're, again, also for talent, competing with venture capitalists who are investing alternative. We've got a question that's a bit linked to, it's about intellectual property, because in some areas innovators are also quite keen on, or think about, well, what happens to my intellectual property? Legally, it goes normally to the company, right? But maybe that's also a way to reward them and deal slightly different with that. So we've got a question from Yannick Bruno. How do you manage the intellectual property in the innovation process? In terms of fast innovation iteration, we need to share but protect your idea at an international level.
Yeah, that's an interesting and a nuanced question. I mean, some IP is easy to protect, like in biotech, relatively easy. But if you talk about business models and all the rest of it, it's much more difficult, because also you want to share it and expose it to the market, and then the question becomes, what can you even protect from an IP perspective? And I spent the better part of my biotech career thinking about these things, so I appreciate the complexity. But what I would say is that usually the big differentiator, at least in business model innovation, is not IP or an idea. It's the motivation and resources to pursue that idea. Many people have the same idea or a similar idea. Let's use digital to do X, Y, Z. It's not like it's that unique. Usually, people have been thinking about it, talking about it, whatever. The question is who has the resources and motivation and the luck often to get it right. And they studied some MBAs from Harvard once and who had started businesses, and they tried to figure out what is the correlation to the success of the startup or the business that they launched. And they looked at grades and this and that. The only thing that was statistically significant was who had enough money after the first failure or the second failure, to keep learning and doing it. That was the only thing that mattered. So usually the idea is not that unique. Motivation is very unique. And like I said, I don't think there's anything wrong with making people who create $100 million business getting a couple of $1 million. For me, it seems quite obvious.
Thank you very much. That's an interesting remark. That it's the rarity is actually putting the business model in place, and very often it's not the idea itself. Certainly, that depends also on the industry you're looking at, but we shouldn't be just talking about, I don't know, pharmaceuticals or these kind of high-tech industry. Well, these industries where it's about more the technical innovation, probably that's what you call it, or the idea that makes a huge difference. As time is fleeting, let's move on to rule number 8, which is about stewardship. Innovation needs stewardship. What do you mean with that, Pontus?
Yeah, it's another one of my pet peeves, because we always expect things to happen very quickly. I guess in the digital era, we should get the Amazon package or the new business models in 1 or 2 days. But it turns out that to build big businesses, in many industries at least, it takes time. And you have to make investments, you have to build capabilities, distribution, all those kinds of things. And that takes time. And if you look at the average executive tenure, either as a CEO or even a given role, go to LinkedIn and look at the tenures of people who work in large companies and see how long they stay in a given role. And big companies have very deliberate rotation plans. So you go from here to there to that. Those people who they identify as high potential, they kind of say, okay, now you're going to be a country manager, now you're going to be a marketing, whatever. They want to expose you to a set of experiences so you can then rise up in the organization. And those they're usually between 2 and 4 years, and then they rotate you. So sometimes in geography, sometimes in functions, whatever it may be. Now, if you want to advance in your career, which most of these high-performing people by definition want to, you need to be successful in each one of those roles. Otherwise, that's it. Game over for you in that company to ever get to a really senior place. So you're not going to do anything very brave usually, and even if you are, you kind of have to recognize that the investment you make today, the pain you kind of take today in terms of investment and resources and headache and so on, it's going to pay dividends maybe in 5 years, 10 years, and no one might not even remember who kind of kicked it off and got things started. And there's a great story about, this is a Shell story, but I couldn't find the exact source. I didn't put it in the piece, but it was Shell. And they were interviewing a Shell CEO. This was probably 10, 15 years ago. And they were saying, such great results, such impressive performance. And they said, yeah, but it wasn't really me. It was my predecessor who did this and invested in that and blah, blah, blah. And then he said, no, it wasn't even him. It was the predecessor of the predecessor who had made all these investments. And that's why we're having such a great, and I mean, I think actually Shell had pretty long CEO tenures. So I think the point is that innovation sometimes is especially, if you don't own the actual shares in a startup, if you're talking about corporate innovation, it plays out in the long term. And so why would you now invest capital, time, this and that for a thing that's going to mature maybe in 5, 10 years? And I think the truly iconic CEOs, this is what they do. They invest for the future, but they often have the benefit of another strong CEO who's invested for their future. And the companies that I've seen innovate successfully, they have this mindset. Often it's a cultural thing. They feel strongly for the company, for the employees, for the stakeholders, shareholders, communities where they work, whatever. And they think long term. And they don't think like, how is my bonus going to look like in 6 months if I now make this investment? They think, how is the company going to look like in 5 years if I don't make this investment? But go and look at the CEO tenure. Just Google CEO tenure S&P 500. It's not a very long period of time. And so it's really a struggle to then invest for the long term when you're rotated or you're in a given role for a relatively short period of time. And your financial incentives, by the way, are tied to the short term. And some of the companies that are, again, very successful, like a J&J, they've got incentive structures that are much more long term. And again, this seems, for me, is as obvious as rewarding the innovators is, make sure that the people who act as stewards have the right types of incentive structures.
Yeah, so this question's probably a little bit the way we've been going the last 10 to 15 years with shorter tenures, well, stock options. I think we've seen a turnaround since the financial crisis of trying to change the reward structure, particularly for board members, to be a little bit more long term. But would you say that the long term horizon is a big advantage for those companies who are either family owned or who have owner CEOs? I'm thinking of Jeff Bezos, who's been aiming for revenue growth for probably 30 years now, and has always said, well, profitability is going to be a consequence. We've seen that consequence for quite some time, and we've particularly seen the shareholder value increase. But how can we, as a society, or for shareholders, ensure that this long-term horizon is more present let's say on boards or with the top management?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I agree on the point on family firms. Sometimes they can be a bit more conservative and somewhat more resource constrained, and certainly more risk averse than listed companies. But I think they are often very good innovators, and I think the German Mittelstand, is there's lots of examples from there where that plays out. I don't think the mechanics of rewarding the long term are that difficult. You can say, stocks that vest in 5 years. I mean, you can have long term portfolios and all the rest of it, and you can mix it, with short term and long term and so on. But I think a lot of it is just cultural. Like if people grow up in a company and the company treats them well, and the people are told stories and they see and hear that they are building on the shoulders of previous managements and so on, and that's how the company does things, and that's the type of people who get promoted, it's not just a mechanical thing that you'll get some stock options in 5 years. It's actually, this is how we build a great company. And it's about, a little bit against this, kind of the only thing a company should do is shareholder value, because you get into like at what specific point. There are other values, like building an enduring, robust company that employs people in the long term, that's successful in the long term, that is profitable in the long term, and blah blah blah. I mean, I think those are cultural values which can be supported by incentive schemes and other things. But I think we've gone the other way, and I would argue like share buybacks. If you want a quick bump in your share price, buy some shares back. I mean, one can question how sustainable that is in the long term, because that's an immediate kind of impact on bonuses and all the rest of it. So I've seen actually companies that have this mindset. I've seen executives that have the mindset. I don't think it's primarily driven for them by some monetary incentive scheme, however sophisticated. It's more of a cultural and mindset, and they've been in the company for maybe 30 years, and they feel strongly that they want to do something for the next 30 years.
Yeah, that's. I think you're touching here on a super important point, and it's culture, which for me, and I'm just basing that on research that's out there, is one of the main drivers for the innovation. So the question about, okay, what are the specifics of culture, company cultures that actually reward and foster innovation it has been the content of a webinar we've done, I think, 2 months ago for the Innovation Club of the alumni section of EDHEC, and it's available on their website. So if you're interested more in creating an innovation culture, have a look at that. It's called The Right to Fail, because that's one of the important points and characteristics of an innovation culture, giving people the right to fail, because that will help them to experiment. But I see there are quite a few interesting questions still coming in, and let's take this one from Alexandra Sang. How about the innovation by collaboration with competitors? So we're talking about co-opetition. That's a very interesting one. In order to create a more efficient ecosystem. Pontus.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and certainly tempting. But what I find, and I've run into this sometimes in the corporate setting, I find companies struggle to coordinate and collaborate even across divisions and business units, not to mention competitors. And I have a case in my mind where a couple of competitors tried to do something in the digital space in professional services, and they ended up spending so much time with lawyers and the agreement and the contracting and who gets what and what happens if this and that and who sits on the supervisory this and that. It became so slow that it was like all the worst, traits of a corporate innovator multiplied by 3. And so I'm hesitant. I see the logic from a kind of a platonic perspective, but in the human world with conflicting interests and perceptions and suspicions and so on, I guess the short answer is where it could work is if you have some kind of a partner where you collaborate on some things already, you have a history of collaboration and whatever, then that might work. But then you very quickly ask the question, why don't you just merge?
Okay, so you see the cost of collaboration as very often impeding the creation of value by collaboration for innovation. If you want a more detailed answer about that, let me direct you to a recent article that was published, I think, in the January-February edition of the Harvard Business Review by Neil Buff, who is kind of the king of co-opetition. And they are talking about the steps that you need to take in order to collaborate in the area of innovation. And I think this brings us a little bit back also to one of the earlier rules, rule number 4, where you say don't outsource your future. So if you collaborate on innovation, if you believe that innovation is going to be the future of a company, well, be careful how much of those resources and capabilities that you're developing in that collaboration you will outsource. As we're almost at the end of our session, time has just gone by so quickly. Let's just have a quick look at the 8 rules, because maybe seeing those 8 rules will allow you to ask 1 or 2 more questions that we can discuss. I'll just share them again. There we go. So we've been talking about the predictability of innovation, about the timing of innovation. Rather be early, because if you're too late, you'll never be able to catch up. The question of, well, it looks easy, but it's very difficult, particularly when we think about alignment and action. Pontus has mentioned the 3 A's, analysis, alignment, and action, that I will certainly remember. We've just discussed, when answering the last question, innovate close to your core and don't outsource that future. Don't challenge the giants with the same business model was the first rule we've discussed today. And then we've talked more about the leadership challenges, cultural challenges of innovation. You need conviction, you need stewardship, and you need to reward innovation. Let's see whether we have any further questions that are coming in from the audience. Yes, Emery, do you think we can think about innovation when we are in a very mature industry like aviation, which is just fighting to survive at the moment? Thanks for that question, Emery. I know it's your industry, so what's your take on that?
That's a tough one. That's very tough because it's so tied to the macro and, of course, COVID and lockdowns and even the greening of the world and all the rest of it. And of course, aviation has done a tremendous job innovating on the technical front, you know, efficiencies and other types of things, but on the incremental front. I think, you know, business model innovation in aviation is certainly a challenge. And I don't have actually a good answer. It's a little bit like container shipping, like necessary, but a very tough business, very macro driven. And we can only build so much bigger ships, as the Suez blockage showed us. So yeah, I think it's a tough question because it's so macro driven. And in some ways, without COVID, we could have imagined, you know, aviation being a super boom business in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. So unfortunately, as we said, there are also many external factors that we cannot master. The only thing that we can do within companies is getting better at seeing those factors, evaluating those factors early on, and interpreting them as opportunities. And that's the perfect handover to what I just wanted to say at the very end of this webinar, is that at EDHEC we have now, a year and a half ago, founded the chair for Foresight, Innovation and Transformation, called the FIT chair, which helps company in the areas that we've been discussing, but also developing strategic foresight capabilities, which become more and more important in times where we see disruption becoming faster and changes as the pandemic hitting all of us. So as a reaction to that, we are proposing a certificate which might be quite interesting for you in our audience, because it's online and 5 weeks, 100% online. And we are doing a pilot in May. It's actually, I just heard today, it's booked out. If you're very quick, we might open an 11th space for you on the pilot starting end of May. But we have a full launch of that program early October. And it will allow you to scan signals, get better at predicting different scenarios about the environment, and finding strategic solutions to react faster than the competitors, and thus innovate, hopefully not too early, but very early. So that's it from our side. I'm just checking whether there are any further questions, but I think we're almost through. So thank you so much for all those interesting questions. Thank you for, well, over 40 people that have been joining us in this discussion. Thank you also very much to Pontus Siren, who is, as I've mentioned, our innovator in residence here at the Global MBA program at EDHEC Business School. And well, as you will be leaving the room, you'll be seeing a short video about the Strategic Foresight program, explaining the details of what you can be learning in order to make your company a bit more resilient and increase your chances of innovating in the right area and respecting the 8 rules that we've discussed with Pontus. So thank you to all of you. And I'm looking forward to meeting and seeing some of you, because I also see some names of future participants in the Global MBA program. Have a wonderful day, and don't hesitate to contact us at the Global MBA program. Thank you, Siren. Pontus.